Thank you all for coming today. It's nice out and it's hot, so yeah, it means a lot to Karice and I. Like Will said, my name is MOROTI. I am a curator and a friend of Karice. Yeah, that's important. I also before we begin, I also wanted to make a note that this gallery is also in Vancouver, which was once home to the vibrant Black community in Vancouver, and who were dispossessed of their homes and their agency by colonial powers. So I think that it's very fitting that this is happening here and now, and very powerful that Karice's work is here too. So I'm just going to jump into the talk. And I wanted to start our conversation, Karice, by talking about your artistic process. I think that found object and found imagery, art practices, are very fascinating, especially with regards to photography, because it kind of challenges our ideas about how images should be produced, and also just how images should present themselves in the world and in the gallery space. So I wanted to know if you could perhaps talk about how you produce your images, your process, and how this kind of contextually shapes your work.
Okay, thank you. And I want to just thank you so much for being a part of this talk and just having a dialogue with me and my work. So I appreciate you, and I appreciate you being here. I think, that's a question that I receive a lot with my work. I think a lot of the response to my work initially when I started doing it was why don't you get behind the camera? And why don't you take your own images? And I feel the simple answer to that is just that's just not what I do. I'm not interested in that, even though I totally understand the motivation of Black photographers taking up the camera to produce images, because that history is so fraught, and the camera was very much an instrumental tool in our dehumanization and upholding and perpetuating certain stereotypes against us. And so I completely understand why people would ask that question. I think for me, with my work, I'm still continuously so fascinated by this archive that I'm pulling from, Players magazine specifically. I'm just so interested in its history and the moment it was born out of, and just the images themselves. Continuously am so enamored by them, and I really love them, and just I want to continue to respond to them. I think that and I've been talking to other artists about this, even Becky, I've been talking to this, how not engaging with that can be kind of a form of refusal, because it feels the contemporary art landscape is really demanding from Black photographers this very explicit portrayal of the figure. And I think that's interesting, and I think it has a space for photography, especially most recently with As We Rise, the Polygon. That was an amazing portrayal of what that potential is and what that could look like. But I think the simple answer is just that it's just not what my work is. It's not what I want to do.
And how do you make them, if that makes sense?
How do I make the images? Yeah. I think that kind of ties into your question about ethics. Yeah. And I've learned to accept that the ethical way that I'm dealing with these images is actually really rich ground, or really rich conceptual ground to engage with them and figure out how they're going to exist in a gallery space, because the source is kind of fraught. And it's I know I'm not, I know that the way, where these images are sourced from, it can be met with a hesitation, and a particular kind of problematic there. But I think the way that I'm constructing them in the space, not offering the image as a whole, blurring the image or cropping them very kind of strategically, is kind of a process of engaging with that ethics, the ethics behind the image. And also kind of a playful and intuitive one as well. That makes sense.
I think that even kind of bringing these images out of the archive, it actually creates a forum for information to come into light, especially like things with regards to Blackness and how Blackness was portrayed in the past. It really just kind of gives us this skill to balance like where things were and like how things are right now. And I wanted to speak with you about like your choice to actually pull a lot of your images that take inspiration from Players. And Players magazine, if a lot of you don't know, is actually a very fascinating publication. I will let you speak to that. But like it developed out of around the same time as the Black is Beautiful movement in the 70s, which also developed out of the crisis of representation of Blackness in the mainstream in America and some parts of Canada at that time. And Players was kind of meant to be like Black Playboy, as some people would say, but it's kind of went more than that. It did more than that. And I wanted to know if your decision to work with Players is based like just aesthetic based, because a lot of the images and a lot of their editorials are very beautiful, and I think that's something that Playboy also had too. Like there was kind of an art in like the erotic in Playboy and Players, and if this was like an aesthetic decision or if this was like intentional and conceptual.
No, it's like it's so intentional, and like specificity of where I'm sourcing these images from is so integral to I think the understanding of the work, and it's because of that history, like it being dubbed as like the Black Playboy and in response to the crisis of representation that was happening at the time. And it's funny, like all of that history and context didn't come to my work until a little bit later when I started doing digging into the publication. I used to just go to the Dundas Square B&B, which is like books, movies, videos, like all these like used magazines and stuff, and I would just pull a bunch of magazines. And it wasn't only Players, I was also pulling other publications. And even like the difference in language for other erotic publications, like it didn't feel right, and it was reinforcing like a fetishistic portrayal of the Black female body, but Players felt very, very different. And also with the way that the publication started, the first editor was like this Black lesbian radical poet, like based in LA. They brought Black people on to contribute to the content of the magazine. So they weren't only engaged with kind of like the nude and the erotic as like an art form, but also engaging with Black popular culture, Black art, politics. I love reading some of the old articles in the magazines because like they're very much talking about like, yeah, just like Black politics and like Black culture. So I think that history is really, really interesting and integral to the understanding of the work. And I think it's just like a nice little cherry on top that also aesthetically the images are like absolutely stunning. But I think that origin is really important for me. And you can like tell like with the other erotic publications I was pulling, like even something like a Hustlers magazine, it doesn't translate the same for me when I'm like engaging with these images as opposed to Players as a publication. So.
Thank you.
No problem.
I wanted to kind of bring things into the now, where we're at now with regards to the state of Blackness and Black representation. I think that we kind of agree, or for better or for worse, that there are a lot of Black people on screen, Black people in fashion magazines, in erotic magazines, and all of that stuff, and also like Black representation in film and art. And I wanted to ask you, I wanted to ask you, like, if you think that like the Black representation that we are seeing in the mainstream now kind of negates the purpose of like publications like Players, and just like publications that cater specifically to Blackness and speaking to, and bodies of work that speak specifically to Blackness and a Black audience.
Yeah, it's like so complicated. I think speaking about the representations of Black people like in contemporary popular culture, just because like there's nothing that makes me more happy than to see it happening. Like, you know, a black Ariel in The Little Mermaid, or like a Megan Thee Stallion, or even like a Janelle Monáe, who's like recently changing up their aesthetic to be a bit more overtly sexual. Like it makes me so happy to see Black women kind of taking up space, and I think it's very much crucial to like our survival to see that. But like there's another part of me that's like, oh, capitalism, like it's like that representation is so vulnerable to be exploited, and you know, it's like it's so give or take, and it's like such a complicated muddy thing. And you know, even like a Beyonce, like a renaissance, like I love seeing queerness like be given a platform, but like she is a billionaire, right? And like the ethics behind that is like incredibly problematic. So I think like at this point I've kind of just been like, I just want Black people to exist and take up space in any way they can, and I hope that those forms of expression are true and authentic and not being subject to be exploited. So yeah, it's like so tricky and it's so complicated because yeah, those representations, like as much as they're a joy to see, like I feel like there's, you know, a looming kind of thing that makes me very suspicious, which is like so bad to say, but, and I also think of the way that like a lot of those representations are also co-opted by like non-Black people, and like the way that non-Black people profit off of those aesthetics. Especially like with this work and like the modes of representation these women are like adorning themselves with, like the jewelry, the acrylic nails, right? Like that's something that's authentic to me and is very recognizable when I see it, because it reminds me not only of me, but of like the women in my family. But also I can't help but think of like, with like the siege of social media, and you know, we always say like, you know, the Kim Kardashians, like kind of co-opting like Black aesthetics and like profiting off of it. That's also like kind of at the back of my mind and kind of looming.
Yeah, I think one thing I always think about with regards to this fixing of the crisis of representation is this looming threat that you talk about, like what is it going to be taken away? I think about this one aspect of like fashion history. Someone I love very much, Miss Miuccia Prada, who kind of was like, the Black models are doing too much, they are taking too much like space, all of that kind of stuff respectfully, and then like she cut it off, and like then like we just started seeing this entire wave of like whiteness in like fashion, which has changed and like it is now. But I also think about how this story is able to be told. I find that like when we are trying to cater, especially as Black people, and I'm sure this is something that both of us have seen in academia and like as cultural producers, when we're trying to reach a mass audience, we know that, okay, there is only so much we can say, and there's only so much we can depict, like out of respect for other Black people, but also out of this like, I try not to infantilize my audience, especially like a white one, but like sometimes I just have to understand that like you're not going to get it, and like so like why am I doing this in the first place? Yeah. So I think about like what is lost in that sense, especially for like young Black people who are not really in like the position where they can technically see or meet other Black people who are like having these thoughts, and like they have this surface level understanding of like Blackness and like what it means to be Black and that kind of stuff. Yeah. I want to turn back to the aesthetic of the work. I think that one thing I have in my practice that I look at a lot is like the politics of the grotesque, which kind of stands in opposition to like pretty works and like visual pleasures and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that your practice like kind of exists in that limbo between like literal actual visual pleasure and like being direct and obvious about it, but also like kind of hindering or like making opaque the bodies in the frame. And I wanted to know like your opinions about like the politics of discomfort and how you attempt to make sure that like the people, the viewers of your work who encounter the work understand the politics behind the image.
It's like, it is really hard because I feel as if sometimes like the way the work looks is kind of that barrier to access, like, and you know, I don't want to use the word discomfort in the work because like to me it's not uncomfortable, right? I feel like discomfort is a word to suggest more so like the way the viewers are engaging with it, and it's like, okay, but why is it so like uncomfortable to really get to like the root of the work? And I don't want to like, I think with me, like it's very clear that these images like come from a pornographic magazine. Like I want to make that clear in the work, and they, you know, originally were meant to be consumed in kind of like a sexually explicit manner. And yeah, I think people that like choose to ignore that part of the work aren't actually like accessing the work, or they're not understanding it at all. And I think that like, yeah, it's just, I've kind of like let that part go, and it's very much an issue, not an issue. But I think that like, yeah, like if the work is gonna kind of arise some discomforts, like it'll happen, but again, like, I don't want that word to be ascribed to like the work itself. It is very much about intimacy, pleasure, sexuality, and I think it's really important for me to be like specific and intentional about those words, because I don't think a lot of the time historically Black women have been afforded like the space to be explicit about reclaiming that terminology in their work.
Yeah.
So I think it is really important for me to do that and be explicit about that.
I think, thank you, first of all. I think that I really like that you brought up the ideas of intimacy and like pleasure and sexuality. And I think that like with this work there is kind of a digging that has to be done, especially on the part of the viewer, in the sense that they actually have to be confronted with like the images of like Black women in pornography and like just like general visual culture that they have become like conditioned to accept, and like when they are met with this like obvious binary of like softness, it's like really challenges how like we expect Black women to present themselves, which is actually why I really love Woman in Gold, because it's that work behind everyone. Because it's I think a lot about like just like how this work was meant to be received in the first place. This kind of like what's the word, like fetish of like the African and like the erotic, which is still very much a thing. But like in this work, I think about like the Karice Mitchell piece from the titular piece, the piece of From Here I Saw What Happened and I Cried.
Oh yeah.
And I think about how like that work was meant to be like ephemera, to be like, look at the body of this African woman and like it's actually beautiful.
Yeah, I think like too, like this image surprises people all the time because they're like, is this from the same source? And I'm like, yeah, it is. Like it is from the same source. I'm sourcing this image from the exact same publication. But even like the word you just said, like this softness, right? I often even think about like Black women engaging in like sexuality and sensuality aren't offered a softness. Like I feel like that's often like also left out of the narrative, you know, historically. Our sexuality was very much like exploited and constructed as like hyper aggressive and hypersexual and really kind of like hard and in this very kind of, you know, tight binary, but even just like affording this softness and delicacy to the Black female body is also like, is really kind of important in the work as well.
Very powerful too, I think.
Thank you.
This question might be a bit difficult for you, but last semester I spoke to my class about your work.
Thank you.
And one of my students, not black, but like very good points being made. But she did bring up the question of like exploitation as it relates to these images and your work. And she wondered that, she was like, do you know these women? And I was like, no, they're from players. And she was like, do they know that they are like arts now, like in part of people's practices? And I was like, no. And she was like, do you make money from this? I was like, sometimes, yeah. And she was like, so what's the difference between like what you're doing now with these images and like kind of taking the likeness of like the black women, or like some of their likeness, because there is like a cutting and screwing happening, but taking the likeness and the bodies of these black women and like featuring them as part of like bodies of work in your practice, and like what like players was doing initially, and like what we have seen other like institutions like pornographic, like cultural production wise due to like the bodies of black women.
Yeah, no, actually not a question that I haven't gotten before, because people are so like, and understandably so, you're dealing with sensitive subject matter, so I completely understand the concern that's around that. I think for me, like, and this was something that I really had to negotiate with when I first started doing this work, because I was manipulating these images a lot more than what you see them as now, earlier in my practice, as a way to kind of like obscure and really kind of limit people's access and really make them unrecognizable. And I had a professor actually that was just like, well, why don't you just show these images for what they are? And I said, but I'm worried about that. And she was like, well, you know, these women originally participated in this magazine consentingly, like to be circulated through this publication, right? And I often think about this one quote from Dr. Murray Miller-Young, who wrote this book, A Taste for Brown Sugar, which is my favorite book. It's all about writings of black women in pornography. And she basically writes the idea that black women could insert subjectivity, agency, or even resistance into oppressive and alienating representations like pornography may seem unthinkable, but this relationship of power can be and has been refused, deflected, and appropriated by black women themselves. And I think like the deflection of power is really kind of where I try to like answer this question, because as a black woman, I'm consuming them, but I'm redistributing them in a very kind of different way to their original intention. I feel like it's almost going against the original intention, because, you know, these images, it was little to nothing to be imagined with the way that these women were being portrayed, right? Everything was on display. It's an erotic magazine. But by cropping them, you know, I feel like it's kind of going against that intention a little bit. But even like now, the access I'm giving to people, like these magazines now are kind of like very close to my heart. They're like my babies. I don't want to rip them. I want to like start archiving them. If I do ever have an archive, I would be very conscientious about like who is responding to the archive and who wants to like use them. I'm not just gonna do it like give it out to anybody. And also now like these magazines, because the publication no longer exists, it went bankrupt, they're like selling them on eBay for like $300, $400, $500, like some rare issues, and I'm like, that's also like another like interesting part about this work. But I think just thinking about like relationships of power and dynamics of power and being able to kind of like deflect or appropriate them in the work is something that I think about in response to this question. And yeah, like I don't know these women, and like for a long time I really thought, I was like, who do I like contact? Like I was like racking my brain around like, you know, how do I make this, you know, just like trying to make that rational decision in my head. But also I think that what's already existing in the work and the amount of access I'm giving, you know, to these women now and kind of like providing some of that barrier, I feel like is beginning to kind of appropriate structures of power. that were originally there.
I actually want to kind of turn our attention or continue building on this to speak more about like the black gaze as it relates to your work, which in some instances, in most instances, is like stands very different from like the white gaze that we have discussed, that like we know and we have seen in the real world. And I kind of want to build up on Shane Lee's question. Shane Lee wrote the book about Black women, visual culture, and pornography and sexuality. One thing she talks about is this reaction that like older Black women and like members of the Black community have when like sex and like stuff regarding like Black sexuality is like Black female sexuality is like brought to the center of the frame. And like she talks about like this sexual repression, actually bringing up statistics about like what Black women feel comfortable doing in like the bedroom, and like what's like how Black women like take pictures and all of that kind of stuff. So like speaking about like sexual repression and as a defense mechanism against like the historical hypersexualization of the Black female body, and that's caused a lot of flack in the sense that like I think people, when the book was released, people were like, we are trying to not be sexual objects, so you're trying to tell us that this is a bad thing.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's a bad thing, and I actually think that there is actually room for more than like one truth, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And I wanted to know your ideas / thoughts about like this, like more than one tactic to deal with like the historical perception of like the Black female body and how your work contributes to that.
Yeah. When you sent me this question, I loved this question because it got me thinking about even the way that like my grandma responds to my work. You tell your parents or your family, "No, I'm an artist," and it's like, this is the work I make. Like it's hard to explain to her even now, like the kind of work that I'm making. She supports and loves me anyways, and I love it, but she doesn't ask too many questions, and it's fine. And I'm not like, with my mom and my grandmother, like I understand that they had to survive and adopt a respectability politic to some degree, as a mechanism to survive, to thrive in the corporate world. Like that pressure is there. And I think like now, in response to that, I actually kind of like push back against like the sexual repression just a little bit, because I think respectability very much aligned with like a white aesthetic, an upper class aesthetic, right? And I think we really need to ask ourselves like, who are we demanding to be equal to when we adopt that kind of like mode of representation or survival? Even though, it can be true for Black women. I'm not negating the fact that like those representations are very true and very real and authentic, right? I think I just kind of like asked the question as to like, okay, if we're gonna do that, who potentially like gets left out of those modes of representation too? I was thinking a lot about like different aesthetics that we're seeing now, especially like on social media, like TikTok is riddled with aesthetics, but I love like looking at them, like the Black women in luxury aesthetic or like the soft life aesthetic. Like the images that are being upheld in these aesthetics often are still limited to like very white Eurocentric like standards of beauty, and they never leave range for like fatter bodies, dark-skinned women, or like gender non-conforming people. So I'm like suspicious sometimes of these modes of representation that are seeming to like prioritize sexual repression, because often that comes with like some other isms that I don't want to perpetuate. However, I do understand that like we can make room for that, and kind of like the reason why like respectability and repression, like it's an obvious response to the historical ways we've been exploited and hypersexualized, right? Obviously, like we're gonna respond in a way that like wants to protect that and doesn't want to see that exploited. So I get it, but I think that for me, I don't. It's like it's a weird line to walk, because often when sexual repression comes into the conversation. Censorship also comes into the conversation. The elimination of sex work comes into the conversation, and that's not something that I want to like advocate in my work. So it's like definitely, it's complicated. It's complicated.
I think that like even a point that a lot of people missed, some people missed when Shaylee first brought this up, is how like a lot of this repression, kind of like what you were speaking about, is tied to respectability politics, but it's also tied very much to like anti-Blackness.
Yeah.
And not even anti-Blackness with regards to oh, like you are a Black woman, so you need to like definitely act like this, but anti-Blackness in a way that is actually limiting like the possibilities of like how Blackness wants to present itself in the real world, and also critiquing and like judging Black people who have chosen to live like this.
Exactly.
And I think that the definitely I'm very pro be who you are, like do whatever makes you comfortable. But I think I kind of like draw the line where I'm like, oh, when I see people be like, this is the right way to live because this is how white people are going to respect you. And I think that like with these conversations, they don't really take into account like just how like pervasive as like you and like Naya say, like the white gaze is like, bro, like these are but there were literally like Black women in Africa, like just like living their lives, and like white people came and they're like, "Ooh, you are this." So that is, it's like it's really subscribing to these labels without actively trying to like unpack where they came from and like when they became bad things.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah. Also, like throughout like all of my research or like the course of it, like it's as a Black woman, no matter how you show up in this world, like anti-Blackness will find its way to like shut that down or like construct you or put you in a certain box, right? Like it'll always find a way. Whether you are adapting to respectability, whether you are being a hypersexual being, like it'll always find a way to be pervasive in those like sneaky ways. So I think for me it's like, I think just similar to what you said, like we should have the freedom to kind of exist, right? In any way that's like true and authentic to us. However, if it continues to like perpetuate harm, we need to think about that. And I'm also not ignoring or negating that like people adopt certain modes of representation as like a means of survival. And I totally get that.
Yeah, thank you. The next thing I wanted to talk about was Black men.
Why'd you say it like that?
I love Black men. I think that one part of my when we first started speaking to each other, I remember how like psyched out I was to meet you because I was like, we're same but different. In the sense that like in my research and in like my MA program, I was looking at like representations of Black men in Western art history and like just kind of like the hyper aesthetic prints that like those representations and tropes have had in now in the contemporary world. And I think a lot about like these delineators I made of like the Black God and like the Black Matar with regards to like just like this very obvious like hypersexualization of like the Black male body with regards to like being the pinnacle of masculinity, sports and all of that kind of stuff. And like the Matar as like the like, oh my God, this poor Black man, it's not his fault. Like, we have to let him live. And I actually want to focus on like the God trope because when I was talking about like this in the contemporary world, I was very specific and this actually caused like some issues between me and my supervisor where I tried to explain, and I'm sure he understood too, but he just was not having it. Where I tried to explain that like, yes, this is a bad thing, but like we also see Black men be like, as long as I can make it, I am going to like adopt these things and like I'm going to like, at least outside, I would be this person, but like behind closed doors, I would be like me or be the real me. And I think a lot about like the effects that this has caused in like the like relationships between like black men and black women and black cishet men and black gay men who are like, yo, please, we're begging you. Also like thinking about like the rhetoric, like politically, I'm thinking about like Martin Delaney, where he was talking about like productive heterosexuality and was like, black men need to be men, like y'all do all of this and like leave women, like do what you want to your women, but like be men. And like also like recently the fortunately late Kevin Samuels, who was also like passing this kind of rhetoric too. And I wanted to like ask, like, I'm sure we all know why like black men have been able to like profit from their sexuality in the ways that like black women have typically not been allowed.
It's
like
misogyny.
So I wanted to like know your thoughts on like this and like
no, I mean when I like spread that question, the first answer was like it's misogyny, like y'all like hate like women, but you know, I think like black men have been able to leverage their masculinity because, you know, under patriarchy that is what's valued, and you know, so that's why someone like Kevin Samuels or like, you know, these podcasting bros can like have a platform where they're very much like advocating for the violence and harm against black women. And I think that like, that's like the difference. There's like a gender difference. But the similarity is like the way like hypersexuality has been co-opted by black men, right? I know and I understand it's like completely fetishistic. But that has been able to be propped up and profitable under like current contemporary culture. And for black women, they've just like never been afforded the same thing because like being constructed as like a masculine figure, right? Like I even think back to like what happened with Megan Thee Stallion and like not believing black women when violence happens to them, and just like I feel like that is like a clear kind of examples is like the difference is like despite this man committing like a very clear act of violence, like there's still a refusal to acknowledge that he committed said violence. So much so that you're now constructing this black woman, this dark-skinned black woman, I feel like colorism has to enter the conversation too, as a liar, right? So yeah, I just like, the simple answer to that is just misogyny. Misogynoir. We're getting the cue to wrap it up soon.
The
so.
cue? Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Just over there.
Okay, coming. Yeah. I actually kind of wanted to build up on this question, like based off what you're saying with misogynoir and misogyny, and like kind of speak to you about like black women being held to a higher standard than like black men in our community, and like also being placed, being placed in this position where they are like moral signifiers and also like capitalist signifiers. I'm thinking a lot about like the black lady trope during like respectability politics and like the civil rights movement, like be a lady, don't do this. And I'm thinking about like now where we're seeing like people make fun of black women for like getting BBLs and like, but also make fun of, use the same black women in their music videos. And it's like just like very weird. And I wanted to know like real quick, like how do you
just real quick, yeah.
How do you think like these tropes and like these internal structures and dynamics within like the black community like affect black women on like a personal and like larger scale?
This is such a big question. But I'm trying to think of like how to like quickly, I think there's so many like historical things that influence my answer to this question. I think like historically, even when we think back to like activism, like who we expect to be on the front lines, and it's like often, or was like historically often like black women, kind of like, but I also think there's like a question of, or something to consider, like even the way we value like gendered labor too, like under capitalism, right? Oftentimes like the private labor that we see go behind closed doors where black women are like caring for children and, you know, being the bearers of children, like that often goes completely unnoticed. So I think like thinking about values of labor and the kinds of labor are super important to consider. And it's like, even like with like the BBL baddies, like to some degree, like there's an effort of labor to like adopt that look, adopt that aesthetic, right? And I just think that like it just goes ignored. It's not even looked at as being labor. So I think like that's maybe kind of the short and sweet answer I have to that. I know I probably didn't answer that fully. And
it's okay.
there could have been complications in my answer, but I think like those are the things that I'm thinking about.
I also like think about like the scrutiny, which is also really like it doesn't come from a place of critical thinking in a sense, like thinking about like the scrutiny that like Black women face now for like wanting to, Black women facing scrutiny when they want to be comfortable, Black women facing scrutiny when they want to dress up, and like no one is like, why do we feel so comfortable saying these things to Black women, even within the Black community? So yeah, we can talk about that during lunch. But I'm understanding now that like it's time to leave, and thank you all so much. But like I want to finally ask you, which one should I ask you, 14 or 15?
Here. Oh, how can art institutions and the general public better support Black women and Black femme artists without making it feel laborious? Listen to our needs all year round, not only when it's convenient. I also think that institutions need to confront the fact that they're very much capable of replicating the same hierarchies that they want to eradicate, and pay us. That's the short answer.
What's next for you?
What's next for me? I'm doing the Broad Arts Foundation residency with Jonathan, and I have no plans. So that is what I'm doing. I have no plans, and I'm excited to not have plans and just to like be in the studio and like be playful again with like this medium and just keep figuring it out. By no means is this work like finalized. I'm always open to rethink the work, revisit the work, push it, go back on my work. I think that's another thing too, like giving myself the grace to like figure it out, go back maybe, figure out these complicated things because the work is complex. What I'm dealing with is complex and I don't take it, lightly. I want to have the time to figure it out. So that's what it is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody has any questions? We're going to take the next few minutes for people to ask them. Anyone?
Putting people on the spot. It's okay if you don't. It's like a nice day. I'm sure people are eager to leave.
Thank you both so much for this. This is really wonderful. I don't want to sort of backtrack, but I was sort of nagged by a question toward the beginning of your conversation. You spoke so generously about your process and how you think about these images and while you're producing them, thinking archivally both about them as images, but also thinking about the intellectual archive that you're pulling from. And I was really struck by your description of like pulling these magazines out of bins. And so I'm wondering if part of your process or what you think about these objects archivally as objects rather than images and sort of lived objects that were owned by people and treated and sort of circulated and how, and especially when you were talking about your own impulse now to care for them. I'm just interested in the object-based image archive.
Yeah, I think that like it's interesting to think about them as objects because like I was thinking about them as a material because I was cutting them up and like transferring them onto different things and like really kind of engaging with them as a material. And I think it's weird. It's like I'm thinking not only of them as objects but also as like this publication with a rich history and like a very rich background. But now I think that care is just like, because they don't like exist, it's hard to get my hands on them. It's like, they're very rarely in circulation, and when I do get my hands on them, like there is a preciousness that I attach to it. And I feel like any archivist that saw my studio before where I have like these publications just cut up and I'm ripping and tearing them apart, like that's like hellish, like it's awful. But yeah, I think that it's like, I think I'm thinking about them in multiple ways, like as an object, as an image, as a publication, as history, as an archive. It's like all happening at once in my practice. I hope that answers.
Question? Thank you both for that. That was great. I'm really interested how to frame my question well. I have so many questions. Okay, no, I'll ask one. Okay, I'll ask one. Okay, I'm interested in cropping. You were speaking to cropping, and I'm interested in the aesthetics of abstraction in relation to photography as part of my own practice and my own study, but also as something that I see a lot in your work. And I think it's complicated one more level when we think photography, abstraction, sexuality. Like cropping as the kind of encasement for all those kind of those notions. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit more.
Okay.
Like how you make your decisions around cropping, just kind of loosely, especially like we're looking at an image here that is cropped twice. We're looking at images all over the space that are cropped in very different ways. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to it briefly in relation to some of those things.
Yeah, I think that like in terms of cropping with the images, I think more recently in my work, I'm really interested, I think just like in the way that these women are presenting themselves and just like directing attention and specificity to that, like with a gold hoop or with an acrylic nail. That's something that I'm really interested in making like clear and like the forefront of the work. Just because I think that like not only is it kind of recognizable for me and reminds me of like, you know, like acrylic nails, I hear the sound, I think of like my own, like I don't have my nails now, but like the way that like that adornment serves me in my understanding of self and identity, but also the ways that it shows up in these publications, I love because it's just so referential to everything that I'm familiar with and the women that show up in my life. So I think like a lot of the cropping for me, it's like that I want to bring attention to and kind of like be playful, and then again like thinking about cropping and like this question of access, right, to these images and like how much access to the body am I giving the viewer. I feel like cropping and that process is really rich to think about, like just like access and the ethics behind that. So I think it's like a combination of wanting to have something very explicitly on display, especially like with the blue one, like the leather, like and like the ever like the tiny like buttock and like I feel like that's like really special and important to me. It's like a nice moment, but even just like the signifier of leather and patent leather and like thinking about sex and bondage and all of those things, I want to kind of like center that in the work. If that makes sense. And yeah, I feel like that opens up the work to think about it in its multiplicity. I see cropping not as something that's like this, but I think of it as like that.
Yeah. But also like that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We've been talking a lot about the possibilities, but also the limitations of Black women labor when it comes to found images. And I wondered if you have been thinking through the ways in which your own practice either parallel, contradict, or support, both in process and container, the kind of ongoing perpetuation of harm, in that you found them, they belong to someone else, they're on the wall, they're nameless, we don't know who these women are, they were already kind of images that were made with consent, but they're hanging here without consent, right? Like there's a manipulation, the ripping, the tearing, the cropping, the blah, 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 that you're superimposing onto Black women's bodies after it's already been taken away. And then placing them in Vancouver, in this region, in this gallery, in this space, on these white walls. How is it either parallel to, or maybe in contradiction to the way that you see the harm of consumption of Black women?
Yeah, I think that like the work, I'm not hesitant to adopt the contradiction that is within the work, and I feel like I'm working against all of those things, but also within those things. And I think with my efforts and like my response, I'm like trying to make sense of, I think, responding to all of those harms. And I want to like preface this as well, like the work that's happening here I don't do lightly, I don't take lightly. And I do really think about like the response that it's going to garner, and even like the viewers that are gaining access to the work and coming into this space and like having to interact and engage with the work. I think again it like goes back to, or the reason why I'm still so drawn to respond to this archive in a way that does not try to inflict or perpetuate harm, but just like try to tease that out, is thinking, I think, back to my answer about like relationships of power and how like, you know, to think kind of unthinkable that deflecting aspects of power is possible in this work, and I think I'm responding to that possibility. And yeah, I think that like in terms of like the women that are here, I do recognize that they are people that existed or still exist, and that's why it's still kind of like I go back to the ways in which they're like being framed and portrayed, and there is still a lot of care that goes into that. Like care is so fundamental in my practice that I don't take it lightly with like the way the works are existing, and even like, which is now a question that I have to figure, is like the selling of the work. Like even the collecting behind that, I'm like, ooh. That's like the ethics behind these images, but also like the anti-capitalist like side of me too coming out as well. So I think it's like parallel, and I acknowledge that there is like contradiction in the work, and what I'm trying to do might go against my intention, but I don't want to let that fear get in the way of me still trying and being motivated to potentially appropriate this imagery and like tease out the potential in it, if that makes sense.
Can I also add, I'm thinking a lot about like your work in a gallery space, and just like how people encounter Blackness when it is not like in places like this where there's kind of like this air of like respect. I'm thinking about like when I was reading your thesis, you kind of talked about how someone broke into your studio, very strange, and like wrote these things like, ooh, black woman, on the magazines and around some of the work. And I think about like how that kind of thing can not happen in the gallery space. So like, despite all of our issues with like policing and like just like classism and elitism that happens in the art world, I think that like sometimes we also need to think about like these contradictions and how like these power relations actually kind of like protect us and like protect black artists and black artworks in a way from the ways that like they might be encountered in places where we are free, where people are free to be like to do what they think they can do with Blackness and like black art. Thank you all. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Alex, and thank you like to the entire team for making this show so beautiful. And thank you all for joining us today.
Yeah.
And,
Thank you.